It's good to be with you again today. I have good news and bad news. The good news is I remembered my glasses, but the bad news is I forgot my wife. So I knew there was something this morning. I just couldn't quite put my finger on it. But no, actually, Sandy has been up in Frisco this week. Her son and his wife and our two little boys are there, and they've been out of town, and so she's been taking care of the little boys, and so she'll be back with us next week. So. Well, I hope everyone's doing well, and I hope you've had a chance to maybe process things a little bit from what we talked about last week. Just by way of reminder, and maybe for those of you who might not have been here, that what we're trying to do here is take the legacy class. Is this a new class? Okay, take this new legacy class and marry it to the legacy ministry that I've been a part of and helped to start in Georgetown a few years ago. And so again, I thought this was really good last week that I said this, that this is the first wedding in your new chapel, this marriage of this to class. So you're not as impressed with that as I was, but I thought that was a really, really good thing. And so what's kind of driving that is there are kind of some essential components to a successful, if you will, effective seniors ministry. One of those is care for one another. As we get older, we need more care. We've been giving care, but there are things that we need, and we want the church to be able to provide, and also fellowship opportunities. We want to spend time with people who are in the same demographic that we are, and some of us we get lonely, and so it's nice to spend time with other people. And that is where most senior ministries stop: care and fellowship. And I shared with you, the information that I saw on Hill Country Bible Church. I mean, great church, but that's what their senior ministry is all about. It's called Legacy. It's about providing things for them, and we need those things. And that is so good that we have those things. But if we're really going to change the world in the ways that we talked about last week, we got to go beyond that, and there really has to be a sense of mission, that we're not ready to be put out to pasture, that there is a contribution that we can make. And so, what this aspect, the legacy ministry, is about, is mobilizing this group to be involved in the faith development of younger generations. That's really what this is all about. Is we got all these gifted people who have something to contribute in different ways, maybe than what we had at some other point in our lives, but we have all these gifted people, and so we're going to mobilize this group and see if we can't do something to stop that awful trend that I talked about last week, both in here and in the worship assembly, of our decline. And if you were not here, I think perhaps the most disturbing, a couple of them that were most disturbing, was the decline in Churches of Christ, that on average for the past 3 years, every month we've lost 2,000 members, and 9 congregations have closed. The other thing that's most disturbing to me, and it's broader than just our fellowship, but that 64%, and this is by the Barna Group, this is a very reputable research firm, 64% of those under the age of 30 will drop out of church once they leave high school. Some will come back, but the number that is coming back is getting smaller and smaller. And as we saw, last week, we put not all, but names of some of our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids on the wall. And we went with a more conservative number of 50%, and we had to take those names off. And that was, some of us have talked about that was kind of gut-wrenching, because I had a grandson on there that I had to take off. And I don't like that. I don't like the thought of that. And we think that won't happen to us, but statistically it will. And I think a lot of us have had that same experience. And so we're trying to pull out that potential that is in this group to make an impact. You might think you can't. You might think that younger generations aren't interested in what you're having what you have to offer, but we're gonna see some numbers later that will tell you that that's not correct. So you've had a chance to think about this a little bit. I just want to open up this morning with any thoughts about last week, whether it was in here or what I shared in the sermon. Anything you want to add or ask questions about from last time? Speak really loud if you do. Yes, ma'am.
I wasn't here last time. I hope it was recorded. But
It's on the website, as a matter of fact.
it's on the website. Okay, I didn't check. But I have a question. Is this related in any way to the National Legacy Organization that has a similar purpose?
No, I'm not familiar with that. So, but no, this is just something that kind of rose locally.
Okay.
I'd like to know more about that if you want to give me some information. I'd love to know. Because I don't really know of many people who are doing what we're trying to do here. So, anything else? Anything about those numbers or those trends? Yes?
This is not a challenge. I'm just a data analyst, so I do this.
Yeah.
How is that data collected? The churches of Christ are autonomous, and I'm just curious as to how that data is being collected and how it's kept up, today.
Right. A lot of it, some of it was done through individual surveys, but the main source is 21st Christian Publishing Company. There's a Church of Christ directory. It used to be called Where the Saints Meet. Some of you might remember that. But they are the ones who publish. They're the ones who publish the Church of Christ directory. I think it's every 3 years, and so they don't just get information about name and address, but how many churches and how many adherents and how many attenders and all that information. And so that's the main source. Some of the other information that's broader than just our fellowship, some of that comes through the Pew Research Center. They do a survey, a religious landscape survey every 7 years. They did one in 2007, 2014. I'm not sure they're going to do one in 2021 just because of obvious reasons. And then the Barna Group, which is a very reputable research group. So, yes?
You're probably familiar with Matt Flynn.
Yeah.
He's a person who concentrated his ministry, a lot of it, on growing and change in the Church of Christ. And so he did is that what 20th Century is doing now? It's taking over his research?
Yeah. Is Mac even still alive? I don't know. Yeah. He was actually. Monty was a classmate of mine, and Mac was one of my professors at Harding Graduate School. And I was involved in writing a book on campus ministry a few years ago. We had Mac write the foreword to that, just to really think a lot of him. But yeah, I don't think he's doing much anymore. 21st Century Christian really is the most. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh.
What happens to those people? Do those people go to other kinds of churches? Do they drop out and come back when they're having kids? Or do you know where the trend is?
The 2,000 that's just people in general. Some of those will be young adults that might come back, but most of them are either going to other denominations or they're dropping out altogether. And I think I shared the number, and this is from that Pew Research Center, that the number of nuns, N-O-N-E, people who identify as no religious affiliation has gone up 5% in the last 5 years. And that a third of those who are 30 and under identify themselves as having no religious affiliation. So that's what we're seeing in America as a whole, is that number is rising. In America, the more kind of high church, highly liturgical churches, the Methodist, Presbyterian, the more liberal churches, they are in the sharpest decline. Evangelical churches are kind of holding fairly steady, but somewhat of a decline, although, again, they're losing young people. So as far as our fellowship goes, you probably people I know some who just aren't going to church anywhere, but I know more who are going to the celebrations and Austin Stones and Hill Countries and places like that. Well, yes, one more then.
How do they treat in the surveys the churches of Christ who have dropped the of Christ to lose the denominational appearance of the church?
Yeah.
For example, if we were jobs now, the Brentwood Oaks Church,
Right.
how would that be captured in that survey? Would those be lost to the Church of Christ?
A few years ago they were. And I don't know if that's changed or not. Like, yeah, like the Hills. Yeah, yeah. I think churches that were instrumental maybe were pulled out, which that's a relatively, that doesn't move the needle a whole lot because the numbers go back for like 20 years. This overall decline. But yeah, those are not being included as much, I don't think. So, what about this? This passage from Matthew 18 that we talked about last time, where, just to again recap real quickly, this parable that Jesus told about leaving the 99 on the hill and the hills and going after that one sheep, and there was a certain amount of risk in that. And one of the observations I made about that, when you think about the context there, that right before that passage, he's talking about children. Right after that passage, he specifically says, in a similar way, in the same manner, make sure that none of these young ones are neglected. So that context tells me that if there's anybody to whom we are going to apply that passage, that principle of leaving the 99 to go after the one, it ought to be young people, it ought to be children. And one of the ways I apply that is that if there has to be a decision made about something like space usage or programs or whatever, budgeting, that I want my first response not to be whether or not I like it. I want my first response to be, is it going to help them? Now, that's a kind of a tough thing for us. And I'm wondering, again, you've had a week to think about it. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do we vote on whether or not we're going to do that? We'll vote one way or another, right? But that's hard sometimes. Yes, ma'am.
Well, we all realize we're part of the consumer
Yes.
culture. And I think we have to ask the question, do we respond to these needs as consumers or as servants and stewards?
Right. Yeah.
As servants and stewards, we shouldn't be doing how we like it first.
Right. You're exactly right. And I use the example, and I talked last time about how there's a part of me that resists that because I feel like we're enabling something that's kind of a weakness of this young millennials to start with, kind of that I'm entitled to things, and I'll expect people to set aside their wishes for my wishes. And I made the statement, shouldn't they be serving us? Well, the answer is yes, they should, and we're going to show them how to do that. We're going to model that kind of mindset, just like Jesus modeled for his disciples, who should have been washing feet. So it's not a matter of just, okay, whatever you guys want, we're just going to pull back, and you guys can take over the church, and we'll let you do it for a while. It's not what we're talking about at all, but we're just talking about a reaction. And entering into conversation with them about certain things, whatever it might be. We don't have enough room for our children's ministry, and there's this big classroom over here. It'd be great if we could use that for children. Well, we have a class in there, but okay, are we willing to move out of the way so that they can use it? That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. So I want to kind of keep that before you. And just keep asking that question, how seriously are we going to take Matthew 18? How far are we going to be willing to go to reach the one, even if it means making the 99 a bit uncomfortable? So, and I want to go back to Psalm 71. This is a passage that I talked about in the sermon, and this is really the theme passage for Legacy. And we're not going to read that whole chapter again. Do y'all ever memorize Scripture? I've started doing that with one of our citizens, one of our adults with special needs, and it's it's good. I like it. It's hard, and I have to do it every day. I've discovered that I got this passage, and then the next day it's gone. So this would be a good one. This would be a good. You've done that too, huh? This would be a good one to commit to memory. Psalm 71, verses 17 and 18. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. "O God, you have taught me from my earliest childhood, and I constantly tell others about the wonderful things you do. Now that I am old and gray," so he's talking to us here, "now that I am old and gray, do not abandon me, O God. Let me proclaim your power to this new generation, your mighty miracles to all who come after me." And this is the mindset that we must have if we're going to change that trajectory. If we're going to stop pulling those names off the wall, this is the mindset that we have to have. I'm old, I'm gray, but there's unfinished business. And that unfinished business is to proclaim your power to this new generation. And so that's why we're trying to mobilize this group. So we're kind of done with those statistics and the depressing part. So let's talk about how we do it. How can we make an impact on the faith development of generations who are coming after us? Well, one approach is get yourself a praise band and turn down the lights, and somebody pick up some skinny jeans for Charlie, and maybe can we get him to do a spiky hair kind of thing, because that's what young people love, right? That's not the right answer, and no one's more excited to hear that than Charlie, I'm sure. Or maybe you thinking about seeing Charlie that way, but that's not the answer. Another approach might be we've got to really double down on our programs for young people. We got to have the very best people. We need more into that. We have to have the very best programs that we can have for children and teenagers and young adults. That's not the right answer either. In fact, I'll share some numbers with you that'll really surprise you about that, I think. And you've already got that in place. You've got great programs, great people working with children and teenagers and young adults, so that's not really the correct answer either. The answer that I'm going to share is something that I think will surprise you, but I think you will find it to be completely believable as well, and it's just going to resonate with you, and it'll make a lot of sense. And I want to start in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, which is a great example of someone older trying to influence the faith development of someone younger, as Paul is trying to influence Timothy. And there are a couple of things he says here, kind of almost as an aside, but they're really pretty significant, I think, in what we're doing. For example, in chapter 1, verse 5, Paul says, "Timothy, I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And I know that same faith continues strong in you." So just like the psalmist wanted to share something, and he talks about how, from his youth he'd been taught about God. And so that's what Timothy had experienced. An older generation shared their faith with him. And then over in chapter 2, verse 2, well, start in verse 1. "Timothy, my dear son, be strong through the grace that God gives you in Christ Jesus. You have heard me teach things that have been confirmed by many reliable witnesses. Now teach these truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others." And so part of Timothy's faith was an acceptance of the Word of God that was framed by this relationship that he had with Paul. He'd heard Paul talk about these things. And then Paul really kind of elaborates on that in chapter 3, verse 10, where he says, "But you, Timothy, certainly know what I teach and how I live and what my purpose in life is." So there's familiarity here. You know my faith, my patience, my love, and my endurance. You know how much persecution and suffering I have endured. And he goes on and elaborates on that. And then in verse 14, he says, you must remain faithful to the things you have been taught. Here's what he says. You know they are true, for you know you can trust those who taught you. See that common thread in all those passages. He really sums it up well there. You know they are true because you know those who have taught you. We have one of the things I'm concerned about when I look at not just our fellowship, but most churches, is what we refer to as the silo effect. You know, where you've got this group, an age group, you know, say a teen group, and they do teen things, and they some places they even have their own worship assembly. You know, you'll go. I remember going to Saddleback one time, where Rick Warren is the pastor, and you go in, and you know, I was going this way, and I didn't have any kids with me then, but the teenagers were all going over here. They had their own building, even where they were worshiping. And then you pick them up, you know, when you're done, and that was kind of the extent of the interaction. And we need those groups, just like we need a seniors group. But part of the problem that creates that we just have to overcome. We don't stop doing those things, but we're intentional in overcoming it, is finding a way to build some bridges between those silos and make some connections. There's a great story that was in Christian Chronicle a few years ago. The author has been talking about this very thing, how we're losing more and more young people. And he wrote that when my daughter Bailey was 4, she began visiting the nursing home with a family friend named Phyllis. On Wednesday afternoons, my wife Ann would fix I went for a bike ride yesterday, and I think I inhaled all sorts of things. On Wednesday afternoons, my wife Ann would fix a basket of goodies for Bailey to share, and Phyllis would drive by our house to pick her up. Together, they would spend an hour or two talking with their friends at the nursing home. Afterward, Phyllis would take Bailey out for something to eat and catch up with the rest of us at Wednesday evening services. Later, they would tell us stories of their adventures. Occasionally, Phyllis would call the house. Ron, I need to talk with Bailey. Sister so-and-so passed away last night, and I need to talk to her about it. I would hand the phone to Bailey and watch while her grandmother in the faith helped her move through grief toward a shared hope and faith. Phyllis has her own flesh and blood grandchildren. She chose, though, to treat Ann and me like her children in the faith and our children as her grandchildren. She persistently offered a connection to Bailey that was and remains an irresistible call into the community of God's people. As Bailey grew more experienced in walking alongside Phyllis, they began to talk more about what to do in their time together and how to do it. In other words, she's letting the little girl say, hey, let's do this. It was about more than having ownership of the decision. Bailey needed to hear Phyllis's wisdom, and Phyllis needed to access Bailey's insight. They could make better decisions together. We've talked about how, and there's more here, but we've talked about how legacy is not ministry to seniors, it is ministry from seniors. But when you're doing that, you're being ministered to as well. And that's what was going on here. They started making these mutual decisions. And the older lady benefited from the kind of the enthusiasm and the perspective of the one who was younger, just as the one who was younger was benefiting from the lady who was older. They can make better decisions together. And then he adds this. He says, in the years to come, churches that hope to turn this tide of decline and build faith-shaping communities between generations, the very best children's, youth, and family ministries will be the ones that intentionally build lifelong intergenerational connections. Let me read that last paragraph to come. In the years to come, churches that hope to turn this tide will build faith-shaping connections between generations. The very best children's, youth, and family ministries will be the ones that intentionally build lifelong intergenerational connections. So we're talking about changing the trajectory of the church and changing that number of young people who are dropping out, the way that we can best influence them is simply by having a relationship with them. I mean, it just comes down to that. Rather than living in isolation and not knowing one another, that we are building those relationships that cross generations. Now, any idea about why that's so important? And what's the power in that? Any thoughts about that? Why is there so much power in these intergenerational connections? If you need to make a change, or you don't need to make a change, but you're wanting counsel and advice from someone else, you know where most young people are going to turn to get that counsel and advice, don't you? Yeah. That's where they're going to get it. But what it really comes down to is we will most be influenced by those we trust. And I don't care how old you are, those that you most trust are those that you know the best. And if we kind of come, we're in here and they're coming in and they do their thing and we stay away and we don't really do much to build relationships with those who are younger than us, it shouldn't surprise us that we're not going to be able to have much influence on them. And if we really want to influence them, they have to trust us. And for them to trust us, we simply have to know one another. We just simply have to know one another. Yes, ma'am?
It's not only influence that if you develop this relationship with older person, younger person, and it is a relationship and they seek advice from you, their friends who may not see this, may not have it, they see this. So your greatest influence is those outside that see this relationship and want to be a part or something like that. So
Yeah.
their power to me
Yeah.
influences everyone else.
Right. And I was talking to somebody before class. There's a real interesting suggestion here by a guy by the name of Ryan Burge, who is he's a political scientist at Eastern Illinois University. He's also a Baptist minister, and he's written a book on the rise of the nuns, this folks who are unaffiliated. And he said this. He said, church attendance is the first thing that goes, then belonging, and finally belief. And he says it's in that order, that belief goes last. So it's not like young people are leaving because they just stop believing. And some maybe have these lingering doubts, and that happens sometimes, but for the most part, for whatever reason, they quit coming. And then when they quit coming, they lose those connections with other believers. And then once they lose those connections, that's when belief fails. And I just think that's really a significant pattern. I shared last week about my daughter and her journey away from faith, and that's exactly what happened. Just, as an adult, this kind of quit coming and lost those connections that had been so good for her, and then eventually lost her faith altogether. It was in that order. So what we can do to keep that from happening, it's back up here. It's back in forming those connections while they are still here and still a part of our congregations. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think it's even deeper than just keeping them coming. I think they're able, if we have those relationships, they see past the fact that we're old.
Uh-huh.
And in our culture tends to bracket people who are old as having nothing worth giving. And if we have that relationship, they begin to recognize that there is some wisdom here, and they are being bombarded with other messages that are anti-Christian constantly, that they may not be actually consciously taking in, but they are taking it in, and that's often why they stop coming. But having those relationships with people who have some wisdom about those messages makes a huge.
Oh, it really does. It really does. And there's no guarantees. Sometimes, people still choose a path we don't want, but the odds are much, much better if they have multiple relationships with other people. The Fuller Theological Seminary there's a wing of that called Fuller Youth Institute, And they did a study on churches that were reaching young people. And they put it in a book called Growing Young. And they identified, and some others have as well, that for those churches that are reaching young people, there is usually a ratio not of one adult for every 5 children, but the other way around. There are 5 caring adults for every child. And some churches are very intentional about creating those. So one might be a Bible class teacher, it might be a small group leader, but then the others are just people like us who just come alongside them. And I've heard of one church that will, they started this like 6 or 7 years ago when they first maybe went into middle school, and then when they graduated, those 5 individuals or 5 couples kind of came up with them, and prayed for them. It was just a very moving scene to think about the impact that those people had. They have changed the trajectory of some lives as a result of doing that. And again, the solid research points to this. I mentioned Fuller Institute and their book, Growing Young. They identified these common denominators among these churches that were reaching young people. And they all had these sorts of things in common. And multi-generational relationships was the most significant factor. And so one of the questions that they ask is, what keeps you in church? 3% said beliefs. In other words, what the church teaches. The highest response was relationships at 33%. Now, you might think, well, that shouldn't be that way. I mean, what we believe is what really matters, and there's truth to that, but they're not saying this is the way it should be. They're saying this is the way it is, that they value those interpersonal relationships. They ask young people how they would describe their church to a friend. These are the ones who are involved in these churches. Worship was indicated by 12% of these young people. Again, 33%, it was the warmth of the church. So it wasn't the praise band and the young pastor in skinny jeans. It was the warmth of that congregation. Another study asked 19 to 23-year-olds who were connected to a church why. And the number one answer by more than a 2-to-1 margin over programs was personal relationships. 22% said they were connected to this church because of the great programs they had. 45% said it was because of relationships. David Kinnaman, who is the president of the Barna Group, came out with a book in 2019 called Faith for Exiles. I'll read it in a moment from a book he wrote a few years ago called You Lost Me, about why we lost so many young people. But then he followed that up with one about young people who are doing great, young people who have a strong faith. And again, they identified 5 common features in those young people who are spiritually strong. And intergenerational relationships is one of those 5 features. They were asked to respond to this. I feel valued by the people in my life who are older than me. 65% of those who are doing strong in their faith agreed with that. 24% of those who were struggling and who had left did not agree with that. And we don't need surveys to tell us that. I mean, don't most of us have stories like this ourselves, where we were influenced because of older generations? When I grew up in Kentucky in a small rural church. The youth group consisted of me and my 2 brothers, and we didn't like each other. So I really struggled in my faith, and I didn't leave the church, but I left God. And when I went away to the University of Kentucky my freshman year, then I kind of stopped going and really was on a path to be one of those names taken off the wall. And one of the things that made this prodigal son return home was just those relationships that I had with that small rural church in western Kentucky. They did something to me without me even knowing it. I remember Brother Pinkston. I don't even know what his real first name. Maybe it was brother. I don't know. But that's what we called everybody, Brother Pinkston. And he was always be there at the door of this church of about 30 people. And he always wanted to shake hands. And he was missing these 3 fingers, which was not a big deal because we were a farming community and most people were missing a digit or 2. So it was, but he put those 2 fingers out to shake hands, and he would call me young Timothy and all that. And I got where I would go in a side door just to avoid him. But he would always hunt me down and always have a kind word to say, even when I was, sending out vibes that I really don't want to talk to you. And I can think of so many other people like that was part of the appeal of home. Mostly it was being back in a relationship with God, but God's love was being mediated through Brother Pinkston and Brother and Sister Bellamy and all the others who had invested in me when I was a young person. So do you see what's going on here? Do you see what we're talking about, what's happening? Don't tell anybody this, okay? But this is old school. It is really old school. It's not the latest and greatest. It's kind of getting back to where our roots were, because this is the way our generation grew up. We didn't have youth ministers. We didn't have children's ministers. We so much need them in this culture, but our moms and dads were the ones who would teach the classes and do things with us. We'd all go out to dairy dip after church or something, and hang out. I didn't even go to any kind of youth gathering, we called them youth rallies then, until I was in the 10th grade. I didn't know those things even existed. It was happening there among just families. Now, the biggest social difference, I think, between now and then is time. 2-income families. None of the moms worked back then. It's not a matter of this generation is greedy. It takes that for this generation to get by, in many cases anyway. And so many demands for our time that we need people who are going to kind of focus on our children and teenagers. But this is where we come in. We kind of fill some of those gaps. And so this really is just old school. It's getting back to the basics of one generation being involved in the life of another generation. That's the method. Now, next week we're going to talk about what we do, but that's really the method that we use in this approach. Right here first.
I'm not against anything you say, or it's perfectly fine. But I think you really need to take a look at it. Why youngsters are not coming? Why people are going? Is anything wrong with our message? Do we really spend some time analyzing, inquiring about it? If there is something that we change,
Yeah.
why can't we change that? If that discussion goes, then we will, exactly what we're talking about. It's not a hatred or YouTube or anything, but somehow or another way, people put me in there with the love of Christ and the joy hanging around with Christians. Our children goes to college and they're not bothered.
Yeah.
Why is it missing? And want the church gathering? Where is the message is missing in the church? Let us look ourselves first.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
analyze it. Somebody out, hey, this is not the right way. Yes.
Right.
Ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very much upfront, and see where he is coming from. And once that change happens, then everything will happen. You don't need, what basically I think what we are doing is putting a lipstick on a pig.
Yeah. But I do think that anything that we're going to do, first of all, knowing what needs to be done, and anything we are going to do, it still comes down to those relationships. That's sort of the framework in which everything else needs to happen is in those. Yeah.
When we realize, some of things I didn't know,
Yeah.
we don't think about it because we don't grow up in there doing like something. Our children goes out,
Yeah.
colleges are, infected with, ungodly people, and they attracted them.
Yeah.
They are not thinking, this is not me, I don't belong here, I need to get out of here. They are not thinking that. I think the
Yeah.
They are not missing us.
And I think within this framework of relationships is where they could say those sorts of things, and we can ask them, and they trust us. They feel like they can say, here's what the problem is because of that trust. One more comment real quick, then I want to do something else.
Relevance is that how many of our children go to church because they have to or because they get to?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what you said is true, I think. When they're in their late teens, they're still thinking they're going to church because they have to, and when they don't have to, they won't.
Yeah, and that was me, yeah.
One of the challenges that we have is how do we maintain relevance and value?
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me at all that 33% were based on relationships. Relationships are huge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are relationships built on? Faith,
Mm-hmm.
really trust, and
Trust.
respect.
Yeah.
And so if they don't really find those things in church, they're not going to stay after.
Yeah. I want to suggest that, so what we're doing in Legacy is we're trying to invite them alongside us, and we're moving alongside them. And I want to suggest that we make the first step in that. That we are the ones, we're not standing back here just waiting for them to come to us, that we're approaching them, which brings us to our assignment from last week. You thought I'd forgotten that, didn't you? Yeah, remember the assignment last week was when you go out into the worship assembly, just meet a young person. Just introduce yourself to someone or to a young family. Did anybody do that? Any of us do it? Yeah. Any great stories from that? Did anyone say, you have just changed my life? Did any young person point to the baptistry and say, see, here is water, what hinders me from, no, probably not, right? I met three, I think they probably were middle school students, and it was right, I got to get their names, and that was it. And then the worship assembly started. So probably that wasn't transformative in anyone's life, but it is a step. It is a step. And like any other meaningful relationship, it's going to be forged over time through just a series of small steps. And so you might look for them again. Maybe there's no connection there at all. You might look for someone else, but it just begins with you knowing some young person's name and that young person knowing your name. And that could lead to something that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. And so as a group, you might, that's what you're doing individually, but as a group, you might think about doing some things where you can cultivate that. Got trunk or treat coming up, that we heard that appeal for that last week. I don't like that sort of thing. Oh, wait a minute, we're not supposed to do that, are we? We're not supposed to say, I don't like it. We're supposed to say, is it going to help them? So maybe you being there and not just, here's a bunch of us over here talking while they're coming by and grabbing candy, but actually engaging with someone. There's the, walk for water? Many of us are going to walk 4 miles, It'll be, wheelchair for water by the end of it. Maybe we can't do that. Some of us can, but maybe we can be there at some point to cheer them on. Maybe we can be there at the finish line. Maybe we can sponsor whatever it might be. I really would like for you to begin to think in terms of what can we do that will allow us to form more relationships. And you can do some just meeting in and out, but maybe there are some specific things you could do. Maybe this ministry could host a game night for the young adult ministry or for the high school students. I wonder how many of them know how to play 42. How many of them know how to play rook? And they might just enjoy that. You provide the food. Don't let them do that. That's not going to be good at all. You provide the food and just say, Friday night we're gonna play some games and see if you can't get a commitment from some people and somebody who will announce it, in their class. And it's got to end about 8 o'clock because we go to bed pretty early, and they'll be okay with that. Then they'll go out and do something else. But just things like that. One of the things I really enjoyed at Georgetown. We're just about out of time here, but we would have activities where the students would serve the seniors, like they do a Valentine's deal, and have this, and that's fun, that's great. But we changed that around a little bit, where what can we do to serve them? So I remember one time they had a New Year's Eve all-night party, which we were not a part of that at all, but there was breakfast the next morning. And so we made this great breakfast. But what we did was, the rule on our side was, we're not just going to serve them breakfast and then we're going to all go eat over here. As soon as you can, you get out of the serving line and we're going to spread out. We're going to be at different tables and just talk to them. And, what'd you do, and ask about school, anything like that. And then we went from that to serving together. There was some event that lunch needed to be provided. And so the seniors ministry and the high school ministry did those things together. And so what we're doing is just trying to position ourselves to break through these silos and to be able to form relationships with those who are younger. Well, I wish there were, maybe I'll tell you a story next week that I think is so important to this. But I remember a few years ago seeing at a church where there was some special deal on Wednesday night, and one of our elders and his wife had sat down front where the teens normally sat. He didn't know they were going to be there, and they came in, and they all kind of started sitting there, and they thought, oh no, we're in the teen section. And they got up and moved. And Sandy and I were down there as well, and we thought, this is great, we're in the teen section. And we got to talk with them and just had the best time, and I think they enjoyed that as well. So I love this quote by Josh Shipp. Not really sure who he is. I read something of his a long time ago, but he said this. He said, every child is one caring adult away from being a success story. Every child is one caring adult away from being a success story. And maybe you're that adult. Maybe you're that adult. So just be on the lookout for that and continue to develop those relationships. Now, next week, we'll talk about what do we do then. Okay, we're getting to know them. Is that going to change their life? Well, maybe not, but maybe we need to be a little bit more intentional in what we're doing in those relationships. And that's where we'll pick up in our class next time.